Welcome back to Beer Brackets, everybody. We have another amazing interview that we're really excited to share with you guys. Today, we're going to be talking with Matthias Trum from Schlenkerla. So, you might have caught our interview with Steve Gilsonen from Guinness. And how lucky are we, Alessandro? I mean, come on, look at these people that we're getting the chance to have a beer with, open our beer brackets with, and talk to. It's just unbelievable.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, we started high with Steve, and then we're keeping it very high with Matthias from Schlenkerla that kindly accepted to allow us to interview him. And what an interview. That was so much fun.
So for anybody who might not know, Schlenkerla is an incredible historic brewery based in Bamberg, Germany. And they are one of the originators of the Rauch beer style. If you're not familiar with smoked beer, go back and check out our review of the Schlenkerla Marzen. I'll post a link down below in the description. Matthias is the 6th generation owner of this incredible brewery and general manager. It's so many interesting things to say. We had such a great chat with him. We got to talk all about what a day in the life of the general manager of the Schlenkerla brewery is. He told us all about the beer smoking process. We talked about the restaurant that they have there in the brewery, food pairings. We went on and on.
Isn't it delicious? Like, I mean, I'm drinking the Weizen here. Every single one of their beers is just so unique and authentic. Definitely check out the interview, but if you haven't seen the review, I would recommend to check out that one there first because you get an idea of what their beer is. You get our reaction. Joe tries their Marzen for the first time, so you actually get an authentic first time reaction, which was quite fun in my opinion.
Whew, to the smokiness. And right now I'm getting it all over again. I'm just getting flashbacks and memories. And being able to have a Marzen with Matthias was such a pleasure. Guys, enjoy the interview. Long form, we didn't edit it down, so it's about an hour. Cheers. Crack open a Schlenkerla beer if you can get your hands on one. During the interview, drink along with the three of us. Matthias opens his office beer. He tells us all about that, so you'll learn all about the Schlenkerla office beer. Enjoy, guys. Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers.
Well, welcome everybody to our interview with Matthias Trum, who we're very, very excited to have here with us from Schlenkerla Brewery. Matthias, how are you today?
I'm thirsty.
We will definitely get into that. So as you all know, if you've seen our interview with Steve Gilsonen from Guinness, we love to just talk about beer with people who are passionate about beer. And we've been very lucky to have Steve on and now Matthias as well. And so before we get started, so we don't get too thirsty, Alessandro and I do have a bottle of the Marzen available. Matthias has a bottle as well. Can you tell us about the one that you have that you'll be drinking today?
Yeah, that's my office beer.
I love that.
We can talk about that later on a little bit more. I'm a bit of a beer historian, and I like to read a lot about historic beer styles. And obviously, I mean, behind me, you see my ancestor line. I'm the 6th generation here in the brewery. So we have old records dating back to the 1900s, mid-1900s, 1850s, and 19th century, not 1900s. And in fact, back in those days, people usually did not drink water because water was always polluted. It was it contained bacteria, pathogenic bacteria. So the standard drink was beer, obviously. And in order to not get drunk, standard beers back then were lower in alcohol. And here in Bamberg, the brewers, they had found a special brewing technique by which they could do an almost alcohol-free beer. And I stumbled upon that technique, a recipe in the old family archives. And we brought that back 2 years ago. And this is the Hansler, the Schlenkerla Hansler. We actually do a non-smoked version of that as well nowadays. And it comes at 0.9% alcohol. So it's a perfect office beer, and it still has a really rich beer flavor. So it's quite amazing what the brewers back then were able to do.
I love that office beer term. That's fantastic. Well,
and I can keep talking in English even though I drink, so that works fine for me.
Well, let's crack them open and get ready for you here. Just to let you know, I tried your beers for the first time just a couple of weeks ago when we did a review of the Marzen here, and I had never tried anything like this before, so it's such a pleasant surprise for me. And I am a massive fan, so you converted me to a huge Schlenkerla fan. And oh wow, just that aroma! As soon as you pour it out,
Oh yeah, look at that glass. Cheers.
Yeah, official glass too. Cheers, Matthias. Thank you so much for joining us again. So delicious. So we do start our interviews with a similar question because, like I mentioned, we are just fans of the beer world in general and people who make it and people who are passionate about it. So what we like to know to start off with is always, what is a day in the life like for you at the Schlenkerla brewery? I guess COVID has changed some things and maybe you might want to touch on that a little bit too. But on a regular day for you, what's your day like?
Well, the first thing you have to know is that I actually live inside the brewery tavern, the brewer pub. So my personal flat, my family's flat is in the second floor of that building. So I'm always connected to what's going on in the business. So when I look outside the window, I see our beer garden. When I look outside the other window, I see the street where the people are roaming and standing there with a beer. Not in Corona times now, but usually. Yeah. So when I get up in the morning, I'm already basically in the middle of things. So if something went wrong, somebody calls sick in the morning or so, you usually have it on your mobile phone. My standard day is actually first family oriented. So in the morning, I get my children going to school. We're downtown Bamberg. So the school is very close. They can walk up there by themselves in like 5 minutes. Yeah. So then I go up to the brewery. The brewery's up the hill, about 10-minute walk. So nowadays, the brewery is totally up on the Stephansberg mountain, that 10 minutes walking distance here from the brew pub. So that's my first duty in the morning, to walk up there. And already from afar, I can see whether the kiln is running, whether the smoke is going up from the chimney. So that's my first control of whether everything started well in the morning, whether everybody showed up. And then, in fact, I'm pretty much an office guy. We have 10 brewers in the brewery employed, 4 brewmasters, including myself. So I'm not part of the actual operative work. Like, I don't stand at the brewing kettle. I don't fill the wooden barrels for the brewery tavern. But I oversee everything. I do all the connection with the customers, phone conversations, email ordering. Export business is most in my line because I'm pretty much the only one who is fluent in English in the entire business, because we have a lot of very, traditional oriented staff here from the area. They speak a little bit of English, but it's more locally oriented. And that's where the majority of our business is happening. It's all local around Bamberg. So I spend my day at the brewery usually, taking care of customers, doing brewery tours, phone conversations, and all the economic things you have to do, calculations, statistics, et cetera, working with government agencies with all the requirements you have these days. That's a particular burden in Corona times, obviously, with all the additional regulations you have. And of course, managing a business at that time, trying to make sure that there's still enough money there to operate, etc. Because our brewery pub has been closed for a couple of months now. Germany has been in lockdown since November. I guess it's the same in Canada, that a lot of taverns and premises are closed. So that's a big challenge. But so that takes some time at the moment. In the afternoon, then I go back to the tavern. Usually then I spend some time with the family, if possible. In the evening, I have a chat with the regulars at the tavern and take care of things there. So it's pretty much an organizational occupation I have. So it's not that much operative work, not at the tavern either. Like I pour a beer every now and then, or if we're shorthanded, I help out, but I'm not part of the actual operative work all the time. But of course, I have to be available all of the time. Like, my mobile phone is actually tied into the phone system of the tavern, so they can reach me on short dial from everywhere, anytime. So that's a big challenge for me. So even when I'm traveling, I'm just a phone call away when there's something going on. And the old term of the owner of a brewer in German or in Franconian vernacular, the Bräu. So that's brewmaster in short, but it means much more. It means you're the owner, the proprietor, you're how to say that, the patron of the tavern, you're the brewmaster, the janitor, if you will. So you're basically responsible for everything. In my head is all the entire electricity lines and where's the line and where's the water pipe and where's this and where's that. So whenever we get craft people in, I kind of have to coordinate that, because it's really tough to keep track of that in a building as old as this one. So Schlenkerla Tavern goes back to the 15th century. You can see it here behind. Beautiful old ceiling. I can show you that. So here,
look at that. You can see the moldings.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a challenge, but it's also the nicest part of the work, because there's always something to do, and it's so versatile. It's never every day is different in a way. So I enjoy it very much. Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing with us your day. That's we're always interested in finding out. So it's thank you very much. Well, this kind of leads us to the next question. You mentioned it at the beginning. You're sixth generation in the brewery. So how does it feel being part of such a long family tradition? Well, tradition and brewery, like that must be incredible.
Yeah, definitely it is. I mean, there's two sides to it. There's the positive side. It gives you a sense of purpose. You know where you came from. You know your duty or responsibility in life, and there's of course the strong hope and also the strong possibility that my children will continue that. So whatever I do will be continued, and I think that's extremely valuable in our time. I mean, how many people can say that about their job, that it really has a meaning beyond their own existence?
Exactly.
There's also, of course, I don't want to say negative side, but a challenging side to it. It's not that I build up everything by myself. I'm responsible to that what the people before me did and achieved in here. So if I fail or if I do something wrong, I fail my ancestors in a certain way. So it's a big responsibility. And talking about Corona again, that's of course a part of the challenge. If you opened up a small business yourself and now you have to close down because of Corona, that's of course extremely bad and frustrating. But I mean, it's your thing. If that would happen to me, I kind of get the impression that my ancestors out in the cemetery will turn in their graves because they say, "Hey, look what this guy did."
Yeah.
So that's a certain weight on the shoulders which one is carrying. I think the positive effect, the possibility of contributing to a generation's work outweighs that by far.
What's it? I mean, you talk about having a purpose. I think people are always looking. I think humans in general are always looking for a deeper purpose to their life and their work, especially. So I'm sure it has an added weight for you that there's all these past generations that you're trying to keep that history going, and you're trying to keep all their work going as well. But at the same time, it must be so rewarding, like you said. So we wanted to ask those questions because it's so fascinating to hear people's stories who are involved in this long lineage of either in the brewing process specifically, which is what we deal with. It's so fascinating to hear your perspective on it. I guess shifting away from the back end of things a little bit and more into the actual brewing process a little. So for people who might know a little bit about the smoking process when it comes to the rush beers that you produce, a little bit of a general question just to get us started in an easy way. For you, what would you say is the most crucial process, or maybe even the most interesting process for people to know about in the smoking process of the beer that you make?
Well, if we talk about the entire production process, the key technology, the key point is the kilning process, obviously. So quite frankly, that's where the smoke gets into the play. I'm sure you know the basics of brewing beer and making malt. So you start with the barley, you steep that, it starts to germinate. And then comes the part where the green malt needs to be dried. So this drying in a modern malting business is done with hot air, which comes from conventional heating systems, gas-driven, oil-driven, maybe even electricity-driven in cases. And that in Schlenkerla, we do that differently. We have an open fire. We take beechwood for that because that's easily available here in Franconia. To the west of Bamberg is the largest beechwood forest of all of Germany. Small compared to Canadian forests, of course, but big by German standards.
Yeah.
And the beechwood makes up for very good heating quality. Like we get a lot of drying efficiency when we dry the malt over beechwood fire. And it also has a very aromatic and intense smokiness.
It's so
and
yeah.
But you taste that in the beer. And even in the Hansler, which, as I said earlier, it's 0.9% alcohol, it's still intensely smoky at that really low malt rates. And so that definitely is the key technology. And the interesting part is nowadays, with the craft beer revolution that has taken place over the last 2 decades, you can find smoked beers in other countries as well. And smoked beer used to be the original way of doing malt 500 years ago, or until 500 years ago. So the special thing about Schlenkerla is not that we invented the style, but we preserved it in the original form. And the smoked beers you get from other breweries these days, the Anchor Steam in the US, for instance, or the smoked porter, they all work with industrially made malts, which are smoke flavored. Mm-hmm. So there's, in some form, smoke is added in the production process there, but the heating system as such is a modern conventional one. And that results in a different type or a different smoke aroma as you have it in the traditional form. Yeah. The traditional smoking technology you will also find in some whiskey distilleries in Scotland, maybe also in the States and Canada. I'm not sure about that. But this is much more labor intensive, but it will result in a different flavor. Whether that's a better flavor than the modern style, that's actually up to personal perception. In my opinion, yes, it is. Also because the brain drinks along. Yeah, when you know the story behind, when you know it's the real thing, the original thing, that of course makes it different than the modern interpretation of it. But I can understand that the big industrial maltings, which supply huge amounts of breweries and which have to do hundreds of tons per batch, they of course cannot utilize the old technology as we do. Just to give you an idea of size perspective, an industry malting will do per batch up to 500 tons of malt, and that's also in the kilning part. That's about our annual total production. Yeah, so one batch at Schlenkerla is about 4 tons. And if you do a kiln the traditional way, where you shove lugs underneath, you can't go much bigger than that because it's simply impossible to drive a furnace with open fire to such a large extent that you can kiln 200, 300, 400 tons of malt. And that's really where the difference is. The feeling, the fingertips of the maltster who does it that way.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I mean, you can really tell the difference. I described it to Alessandro when we did a review of the Marzen not too long ago. It was my first time trying it. And I described it as being when you're sitting in front of a campfire, an outdoor campfire, and maybe you're there for an evening with family and friends, and you're all sitting around the fire, and the next day you smell your clothes, and it has that embedded campfire, that burning wood smell that just is stuck in your clothes that I personally love. I mean, that's a matter of preference, but you get that so clearly in the beer out of the aroma and the taste. It's almost like you're there just smelling the campfire, and it's unbelievable, the strength and the concentration of the aroma and the taste that it produces. It's incredible.
When you walk past the brewery on Oberer Stephansberg, you will have that smell as well. And whenever I do my rounds in the brewery, my sweater, all that has the smell every night. So I change constantly my clothes. So yeah, that's really the thing, what it is about. And we had years ago, we had a neighbor who moved next to the brewery up from Munich, and he was new to the flavor, and he didn't like it, and he wanted to get us to only kiln at certain times, and there were some engineers there and all these emission control laws and what you have. So that was quite a burden. My father, fought that struggle. But in the end, the local government said, well, this is a historic thing we do, and that takes precedence over someone moving there and wanting to change things. So Munich did a similar thing actually with the beer gardens, where obviously in a beer garden in the evening, it's noisy, it's loud, and people moved there and wanted the beer garden to close at 10 o'clock so they can have a quiet evening. And so Munich made a special law and said, no, a noise from a beer garden is something you have to live with until midnight, and because it's Bavarian tradition. So in a similar way, Bamberg supports the traditional smoke malt production up till now. I can only hope that it will stay that for the future as well.
Yeah, definitely. Let's hope that. I mean, but what I like about the story is that beer wins. So that's good.
Yeah. The guy who was complaining was a teacher, but I don't say anything more about that. So
you should have known when you moved in, right? I mean, you know where you're moving, you know what the surroundings are.
Yeah, exactly. Come on.
But that's the thing. People move next to a kindergarten, and the next day they complain that the children aren't allowed. Yeah, it's quite.
Yeah, you kind of know what's going there.
They had a couple of years ago, there was something in the news. A German woman moved to Switzerland, and she complained about the bells of the cows, which, it's common in Switzerland. Yeah. And she lost that. She actually went to court and sued the neighboring farmer that he had to take off the bells from the cows. But she lost that trial, and everything stayed as it is. And a year later, she applied for Swiss citizenship, and that was declined by arguing that she does not identify herself with the Swiss lifestyle because she was suing against the bells. So to say that's really the way you have to do it,
That's a great story. Going back to what Joe was asking about the smoke process, you mentioned that you predominantly use a beechwood. I know that you also have a beer that in which you use oak. But have you ever tried experimenting with other types of wood? And if so, what are the differences?
Well, I mean, we have tried some others, but we haven't brought them to a product range, if you will. I mean, historically, brewers would use whatever wood they had available. Any type of needle trees usually are a problem because they're too I don't know the English word for that.
The sap.
The sap, which is glue-like.
Yeah.
It kind of ruins your kilning system over time. So you have to take hardwood, usually from leaf trees, and then it's a question of aroma. And of course, technically, you can do a lot of different things. And I don't want to tell too much, but we have some ideas along that line to introduce other styles in the future. And only in the last 2 or 3 years, we had our hands full. We didn't have the time to introduce something like that. Yeah. But yes, it's obviously possible. And I know from some craft brewers in the United States that experimented with kilning their malt over various types of fires from various trees. Mm-hmm. And yes, there's a long range of what you can do there.
That's awesome. One thing that we'd like to ask everybody, what's your personal favorite out of all the beers that Schlenkerla produces? Is there one that is your go-to? Is there one that maybe has more sentimental value for you? Is there one that stands out as your favorite of the group?
It's a little bit a question of the day and of the mood one is. So
good answer.
Obviously, the Hansler is the office beer, and I wouldn't drink a Doppelbock in office because then your office day is over. It kind of depends. Like my two favorites actually are the Oak Smoke Doppelbock and the Fasten beer, the Lent beer. Mainly because they're seasonal, and at least here in Germany, we both do them only seasonally. And when you're in that Christmas mood and it's cold outside and you have the warmth from the heater inside and that coziness and maybe snowflakes outside, then that rich flavor from the Oak Smoke Doppelbock is just a perfect addition to it. So it's the Schlenkerla answer to mulled wine, if you will. And my mother actually came, she died a couple of years ago, came from Sweden. And in Sweden, they have something called glögg, you might have heard of that. It's a special mulled wine which is boosted with spirits, and it has walnuts on that. And
sounds so good.
That always kind of comes to mind when I have the oak smoke double bock, because it's almost like liquor-like. When you look at the glass, you see the schleers on the side from the alcohol, because it's so intense, like in a good whiskey, basically. So that in the wintertime is just perfect. And now time of Lent is almost over. The Fasten beer is just great in the evenings. It replaces basically an entire meal. So you can only go with that, and don't have to eat anything to go in addition. So those two are my favorites.
That's awesome. It's nice that you mentioned the Doppelbock with the oak, because that's one that I recently tried. I tried like most of the ones that are available here in the US, but I recently tried that, and that replaced my favorite, which was the Urbach. So that's my new favorite, the Doppelbock with the oak. It's absolutely fantastic. And that's a great lead into the next question that I was going to ask you. Can you tell us a little bit about the range of beers that you have available, and what are the differences? Just like, a general talk, so that people that might not know about the brewery can kind of start like exploring.
Yeah. So what you are having, the Madsen Rauch beer, that's the classic style. That's the old family recipe that has been around for centuries, basically. It's brewed with 100% smoke malt from our own malting operation. Wee bit of roast malt, because we have to balance the color variances between malt batches, because when you run an open fire kiln, obviously you cannot adjust the color exactly to every nuance. So we have to balance that a little bit. But in principle, it's 100% smoke malt. So this is about, I'd say, 3/4 of our total production. It's all the classic Märzen. When you're traveling here in Germany or also in the United States, usually what you will find is the classic Märzen. Canada, LCBO only has the classic Märzen in its assortment. It's the main brand. And if you look to the standard rating sites, ratebeer.com, or also on Untapped, it's, I guess, the most drank smoked beer out there. There's the big brother of the Märzen, that's the Urbach, which you were referring to. It's in principle the same recipe, but it has a higher malt to water ratio and a higher hoppiness, which in flavor doesn't show that strongly because the maltiness is so rich. So that's something we serve at the Bockbier time here in Bamberg. Bockbier time in Bamberg is always in fall. So all the local breweries have their Bockbier tappings then, which is a big event for young people getting together one evening and enjoying their Bock beers. At Christmas time, we have the Eiche double bock, which we mentioned already. The difference is that the malt there is kilned with an oak wood fire, not with a beechwood fire. Apart from that, the brewing recipe is somewhat similar to the Urbach, but yet a higher malt to water ratio. And we use aroma hops in that one rather than bitter hops, because the smokiness of the oak smoke is not as dominant as in the classic beechwood smokes. Yeah, so we need a certain more nuanced and balanced hoppiness to go with that. And then we have a number of other seasonal styles. There's the Fasten beer, which we mentioned earlier on. This is an unfiltered smoke beer. It's actually done with a blend of smoke malt and regular malt, so it's not as smoky as the classic. And this comes from the old monastery tradition of Lenten beers. So in the time of Lent, the monks were not allowed to have solid food during the day, but liquids were allowed. So the Latin proverb for that was liquida non frangunt iunum. Liquids don't break the fast. And so during the day, the monks only drank. And in order to not become too hungry, they drank unfiltered and a little bit more richer beer. And in that line of history is our Fasten beer. And then there is a pale lager from Schlenkerla, helles lager, which is actually not brewed with smoke malt, but it gets a certain smokiness from being fermented by yeast, which has fermented a regular Märzen batch before. Our US importer for some time marketed as the homeopathic smoke beer. That was always the expression. Because when you come from regular beer and did not have smoke beer before, the Helles will also have a very defined smoky aroma and flavor. So it's actually an introduction to the smoke beer style, which brings you gradually into the actual smoky flavor. In the summertime, we do something, again, historically special. It's the Schlenkerla Kreuzen, the Kreuzen. It's not available in North America. We only do that here in Europe, basically. The Kreuzen style, the Kreuzen in the brewer's language, that's the foam bubbles which you see in a fermenting beer on top of the beer. And remember, everything Schlenkerla does is about history and historic beer styles. In the old days, it was not possible to pressure lager your beers. You had big wooden barrels, the beer would lager in there, but these wooden barrels would not hold the pressure very well. So over time, pressurization went down and eventually the beer became stale. That's the first piece of the puzzle you need to know. The second piece of the puzzle is that before the invention of artificial cooling, bottom fermented beers were only brewed in the wintertime, because for bottom fermented beers, you need cool temperatures for main fermentation. At the same time, bottom fermented beers always were regarded as the higher quality beers because they don't give as much headaches, or they don't give headache, and they're easier digestible, and so they were regarded as the high grade beer. So people, of course, were interested in getting bottom fermented beer rather than top fermented beer. Now in the summertime, when you lagered your bottom fermented beer from the winter all the way till summer, you would end up with a stale like beer, with a very low carbonation beer. And here in Franconia, that style is still around. It's called a Keller beer. That's what people drink in the beer gardens in the summertime. But there also was the possibility to get that Keller beer or that long lagered beer re-fermented again by adding a little bit of wort from a fresh batch, and to get the fermentation again. And when you do that, you will get new foam bubbles on the already lagered beer. And in the brewer's language, this is called Aufkreuzen. So you re-ferment, you recarbonize it by natural means. And that's exactly what we do for the Kreuzen beer, because that's what brewers did in the old days for a fresh, refreshing summer beer. We take the Schlenkerla lager, the pale lager, which is not mainly smoky, and we add about 10 to 15% of wort from the classic Märzen. We get the fermentation going again for a couple of days, and then it's bottled or barreled, and that's a refreshing summer beer. It's very light in smokiness. From the color, it's amber color roughly, and extremely refreshing summer beer. 4.3% alcohol, so not too strong on that end. And in the summertime, just perfect addition. What else we have? We have a smoked wheat beer that was introduced in the 1990s. This is, of course, top fermented, like the typical Bavarian wheat beers. Wheat beer is always a blend of barley malt and wheat malt. And in the Schlenkerla wheat beer, only the barley malt portion is smoked malt. Okay. The wheat malt is a regular one, so it's not as smoky as the classic. And then the newest addition to the family, as I said earlier, is the Hansler, the low alcohol. From the old days. That's special Bamberg brewing technique, which was a special mashing and lautering technique, which the old brewers utilized, bringing the beer to 0.9% alcohol. And we do that. The Hansler is the smoke beer version of it. And then there's also, under the original name, as the brewers back then called it, the Heinzlein, Little Heinz, because it was a children's beer. That's why they called it that way. Or also a children's beer. It was for workers and for children. And from the Heinzlein, there is a pale one and a dark one, but that's only available here locally. It's not exported at the moment, but maybe in the long run. So yeah, I think we're pretty much through. And from the Bock beers, from the Urbock, from the Fasten beer, and from the Eiche, we also have vintage editions. So we bottle those and we keep them for 4 or 5 years in our rock cellars, 10 meters below ground under the brewery. and they're unfiltered, especially unfiltered, and they continue to ferment and develop the flavor in the bottles. And it's a really unique treat. It's like Schlenkerla balsamico, if you will, and really, really, really unique flavor. So limited edition, 1,000 bottles roughly per year, and only available in our online store and only in Europe, unfortunately.
That sounds so good. I think, okay, so shifting gears a little bit, there's something that I really wanted to ask you that I'm really curious about, because ideally we would love to make it out to Bamberg one day and come visit the pub and the brewery and enjoy some food along with sampling different beers. So I did see from following you guys on social media, I saw some photos of the restaurant that is there along with the bar at the street. So I'm curious, is there the same history to the food that you serve as there is to the beer? Or is it more along the lines of just a regular restaurant where you're bringing a specific chef to pair food along with the different beers that you have? We're curious about that just because we've never been and we couldn't find too much information on it online. If you could tell us a little bit about either, is there a strong history behind the food that you serve? Is there a lot of thought and effort put into pairing it with specific beers? Do serving staff sort of recommend specific dishes to go with specific beers? So on and so forth. Anything you could tell us about that would be great.
There is a long family line on that as well. When you look here, you see that picture. That's my great grandmother, and she ran the kitchen. My grandmother ran the kitchen, and so forth. So there was always the family element to it. The food does not quite have the history as the beer does, because obviously there's not a technological production process behind it or a family recipe. I do indeed have an old cookbook of the sister of my great-grandmother, and we're in the process of actually transcribing that into modern writing, because at the moment nobody can really decipher it. So probably or possibly there are quite some recipe gems in that one. But as you pointed out, it's not that his historic line in that well. So what we serve is traditional Franconian food, which is not that different from Bavarian food. Sauerkraut, knuckles, dumplings.
Love knuckles.
Exactly. In Franconia, actually, the biggest hit, if you will, is not the beer knuckle from Bavaria. It's the Shoyfella, which is the shoulder of the pork. Less bone, more meat. Franconians are smarter than Bavarians. No, no, it's just a Franconian version. So flavor-wise, it's relatively similar, though the meat here is a little bit more tender than the one on the leg. But there's one dish standing out, which is the so-called Bamberg style onion. The Bamberg style onion is something you will only find here. And it's a very old recipe. It won a prize a couple of decades ago in a kitchen contest in which they wanted to find a representing dish for Bamberg. But the woman who entered that recipe, she claimed that it was an old family recipe. So supposedly it is. What you need to know for that is that Bamberg is not only a brewing town. We have 10 breweries here with 70,000 residents, so a huge brewery density. But we're also a gardening town. The Bamberg gardeners are very representatives for the city. They are also part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Garden City. And when you drive in Bamberg along the streets, it looks all very densely constructed with houses, but behind the houses, you actually have huge gardens in which all kinds of vegetables are grown. And when you go to the pedestrian zone, there's a big market where you can purchase all these locally grown vegetables. So there's a lot of history to that one. And the Bamberg gardeners were called the onion stumpers.
Onion stumper.
The onion stumpers, Zwiebeltreter in German, onion stumper. The reason for this was, and this is actually documented in the local gardening museum, in the gardening history. The story behind this was that the Bamberg onions are bigger than onions you get elsewhere. And the gardeners achieved it in such a way, they put little pieces of wood underneath their feet, and they were stomping onto the onions when they were growing, thereby keeping the plant small so that it wouldn't drain so much resources from the onions. And that way the onions became bigger. So the Bamberg type onion is about that size. Yeah. I had an American here who called it Chernobyl size onion. But it's not, they've always been that size, so radiation has nothing to do with it. And it's a special recipe. You carve out the inside of the onion, you fill that with minced meat, a mixture of pork belly and pork meat. You roast it in the oven for several hours, a smoked beer sauce to go with it, mashed potatoes, and a piece of bacon. And it's a perfect addition to the smoked beer.
That sounds
yeah. It's very mild in flavor, so it's you have a defined aroma, of course, from the pork meat, which is always very defined, and the sweetness from the onion, because it's not a sharp onion, a spicy onion. It's a very sweet onion, and that goes with the smokiness of the sauce, and of course the smokiness from the beer. It's just the perfect combination.
Is it a white onion?
It's a white onion. The recipe is on our website. If you want to share that with your viewers, you can copy and paste the browser address there, and yeah. So it's actually my preferred dish from the tavern.
Okay, and we didn't have to go to Bamberg before. We have to go now, and we have to order this.
Exactly.
On the list.
We also have something else which we introduced. When was that? Roughly 15 years ago. We introduced a special Schlenkerla sausage. So obviously Germany is known for its sausages, and every county has its own sausage style. So you get long ones, thick ones, thin ones, small ones. And the Schlenkerla sausage is one of the smaller ones. And the special thing is that these are not only filled with meat, but also with smoked malt. So you get that sweety, smoky aroma from the smoked malt with it. And it's a really nice aroma, and also works well with the beer. So that's something we started 15 years ago. Just, I had a very creative chef. I still have him. And he thought of that recipe, and it's a really great contribution to our menu. And hopefully my children will continue it one day.
Yeah. All right, Alessandro, start saving the calories now, because as soon as COVID is over and we can travel, we're going to.
Oh yeah, we're just waiting for the restriction to be lifted. We have
everybody is.
We're on our way, and
I guess by fall everything should open up again.
We'd hope so.
That's we've been talking about that, like saying we're shooting for kind of Christmas time as like a good time to come to Europe and have some fun beer traveling.
When there's not a mutation coming in, that's the only.
Exactly. Well, let's hope. But sticking around to all these wonderful, and thank you for sharing all these recipes and ideas. It's amazing. Like we both love cooking, so we're definitely going to be looking into this more in detail. But specifically about the Marzen, since it's one of the most accessible beer, seems to be like around the world. Like what would you say is, in your opinion, the best pairing that you could maybe suggest to people to do? Like, absolutely, you got to try the Marzen and this type of pairing. Is it one of these dishes?
Well, with the Bamberg style onion, that's a perfect combination. So if you have the means to prepare that, if you get onions that size locally and of that flavor, so they shouldn't be spicy, that's a very good combination. Apart from that, any rich meat dish is also a fine combination. Even barbecued meat, smoked meats in general. So all these combinations work well. You probably heard of Garrett Oliver, brewmaster of Brooklyn Brewery, and he wrote the book At the Brewmaster's Table. So he had a number of combinations in there, and I think he took part in a food pairing competition of food and beer back in 2005, 2006, and he actually combined the smoked wheat beer with smoked salmon, and that was like one of his steps of actually winning that competition. So anything smoky, from smoked cheese over smoked fish, and definitely smoked meat, will work well with a smoked beer. Also, deer, like very game aromatic meat. So all that will work well. Yeah.
Awesome.
Matthias, one thing I wanted to ask you about, and we kind of hinted about this before the interview when we were chatting a little bit. I wanted to ask you about distribution for Schlenkerla beers, because as you kind of hinted, the Marzen is available at the LCBO in Ontario, specifically where I live. And for Alessandro, he can go into the local liquor stores and he can find a couple of different Schlenkerla beers there. But of course, he can't find the whole wide range. What I was curious about, because I had never tried the beer and I hadn't even heard of it before we started doing this channel, and Alessandro introduced it to me. And I've talked to a lot of people that I know who are beer connoisseurs or big fans and love trying different styles of beer, different craft beers, or beers that are outside of their comfort zone of things that they've known before. And not everybody has heard of Schlenkerla, which is a shame because obviously it's so established back in history. You're the sixth generation of your family who's producing this beer. So what I was wondering, what I would love to hear your side on is there a reason? You mentioned the style of the smoking process where it's still done using the actual burning of the beechwood. Does the actual production process restrict you from producing on a certain level that would allow for more mass distribution of all the different styles that you produce to all countries around the world? Is there a specific, let's say, deliberate reason for keeping things small to keep the history and the traditions alive and to keep things done a certain way and only distribute a certain amount? I'd like to know a little bit more about that, because from my side, it's a shame that I can't find all the beers that Schlenkerla offers and that there aren't more people who have heard about it and tried it.
Well, there's definitely a limitation of what we can do. So we do roughly 20,000 barrels per year, or 20,000 hectoliters in German calculation. And that's pretty much about the limit what we can do. Maybe tweak a little more, but then we're at the end of the malting operation. The brewery actually might be able to do a bit more. So from the Helles or from the new Heinzlein style, we could add a couple of hectoliters. But from the malting end, that's where we can go. And we cannot scale that up. It doesn't work because when you scale it up, you lose the aroma and the flavor. And we don't have an intention to do that. Also on the side where the breweries, we cannot grow to any point. We can grow underneath, like we can add lagering vessels because the rock cellars are just humongous and huge. It's a maze down there. But the production as such is limited. And at the same time, we're obviously limited in our financial power. So a lot of beers you see nowadays worldwide, even craft beers, they have big industry breweries behind them with their distribution and financing power. Big example is the Firestone Walker, which was purchased for $1 billion or so from AB InBev or from one of the big players. Here in Germany, a known example was the Köstritzer brewery. Köstritzer, they do black beer, and they were based in Eastern Germany. And after reunification, they were bought up by the Bitburger brewery, which is one of the big players on the German market. And they just, I don't know, increased the size 100 times of that brewery. Yeah. So when you have the market power, when you have the big industry power, you can do that with a beer. And I mean, that's what AB InBev, that's their business model. AB InBev has hundreds and hundreds of brands. For many brands, you probably don't even know that they belong to that big corporation. And they, of course, can push them into markets. For us, that doesn't work. We do 50 to 75% of our sales we do locally. 25% of all the smoke is actually drank in our own brewery tavern.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, now in Corona times, that's actually a burden because we lose a lot of the hectoliters we're doing. But that's just the way Schlenkerla is, and that's the family line behind it. Because if we were any bigger, we couldn't do it the way we were doing it now. And so all the export to Canada, to United States, we depend on a good importing company who knows what Schlenkerla is about. And who has the resources to actually do a distribution. So usually these import companies either have a huge range of beers in order to make it feasible to organize the transport, or they have one or two big brands, which are their, what's that called? Butter and bread.
Butter.
Yeah, and then they put the specials on top.
Yeah.
Canada is particularly complicated about that, same as Scandinavia, because obviously the LCBO has a very different form of purchasing the decisions than normal companies do. So you have to register there. You have to get your listing in that. And we've been trying to get seasonal listings for the Eiche or for the Urbock at LCBO, but that just doesn't work because it's a bureaucracy. Yeah. So they take regular, which I'm very happy about because volume-wise, sales-wise, it's below their threshold, which they usually do. But apparently there's a certain awareness for this special nature of Schlenkerla. But Schlenkerla can and will never be a mainstream beer which will penetrate large markets. There's one difference though. Finland.
Really?
Finland is totally different. It always amazes me. Just to give you an idea, there's 5 million people living in Finland, roughly. And we sell more beer there than in the United States, almost.
Oh.
It's really crazy. In Finland, you find Schlenkerla in every supermarket, even in discount stores, in Lidl and that. Schlenkerla is everywhere. For them, it's a mainstream beer. It has probably something to do with the history of sauna and smoke. Smoke foods, smoked products are very popular in Finland. And
eat a lot of smoked fish, right? So maybe it pairs well with that.
Yeah. In Finnish, it's called savulut. So smoked beer. Olut is beer and savu is smoke. And Finland is really different. But in every other country, you have to go to specialty stores to find this. And United States actually is organized quite well. The import company there, they bring it to some whole food markets and some of the bigger players. But usually it will be hard to find Schlenkerla because we don't have the marketing and distribution power to push us into markets.
Makes sense. And that's what we figured when we discussed asking you that beforehand. I mean, the logical answer would be that it's to keep the quality and the style of production the way it is, and that it's just not scalable in that sense. But you know what? That keeps it special. And I think the fact that you do have to, at least in Ontario, you do have to search it out a little bit. And even not necessarily every LCBO will carry it at the same time. I had to find it. I had to drive to a specific LCBO that was carrying it to pick it up. But you know what? That adds to kind of the lore of it, which Alessandro and I definitely appreciate. We love beer with a good story that's unique. And
like the Westvleteren beers from Belgium, the Trappist Westvleteren, you probably heard of them. They are also very hard to find. And
it makes it exactly what Joe said. Like you need to know about the secret. You need to find it somewhere. So that's maybe a mission for our viewers. Like if you're watching this interview, find where the Marzen is closest to you and try it because it's absolutely worth it. And staying a little bit on that line, we mentioned there's such a long history behind Schlenkerla and the brewery. Are there any story or even legends that you could share with us about the brewery? Something that in the past of what you've heard while being part of that long family tradition.
We love stories.
Well, the obvious, maybe a little known story is where the name Schlenkerla comes from. So when you look at the label, I can put that here. There you go.
There he is. Yeah.
Here you see this guy with a stick and the beer in his hand, and that was actually the father of. Oh my God. This guy here.
Okay.
So the father of that one, Andreas Graser, so my great-great-grandfather. There's a legend that he had an accident in the brewery. We don't know what happened. Maybe he fell over a wooden barrel or maybe a brewery horse stepped on his toe. But what we know is that he was limping afterwards and he was dangling his arms in order to keep the balance when walking. And that weavering or dangling of arms in Franconian vernacular is called Schlenkern. Also like a drunk person would walk, a dangling walk.
Yeah, exactly.
So the regulars gave him the fun name Schlenkerla, the little dangler, the dangle walker, so to say. Yeah, and when they said we go to Schlenkerla, they referred to the person. And over time, that name became synonymous for the tavern and for the beer. And here, Michael Graser, this one, he actually registered that as a brand name in the 1920s. So, I mean, that's how to say that. You have to be quite confident in yourself that you register the fun name of your father as a brand.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a good step forward, and so yeah, that's the one story. And today, when you do a city tour in Bamberg is a tourist destination where UNESCO World Heritage with 2,000 monuments, monumental buildings in town, a big cathedral. And when you do a city tour, Schlenkerla is part of that tour. Like you have one stop in front of our brewery tavern and they will tell you about smoke beer and that. And what they always will tell you is that the smoky flavor is something you need to acquire. You have to drink yourself into. And there's an old Bamberg proverb that you have to drink 3 pints in order to fully acquire the flavor. So after the 3rd pint, you're going to be in a certain Schlenkerla mood in a way. So the name really became program over time. So, but that's the most famous story. But apart from that, there's a number of other anecdotes. For instance, I told you that the brewery is up on the hill. So I walk up 10 minutes up the hill every morning. My father told me that the first truck driver we had was also the last horse carriage driver. So up until World War II or shortly after World War II, beer was delivered out with a horse carriage. And when the horse carriage was full with barrels and the horses would walk down the hill, there was, of course, a huge push from the weight of the beer in the carriage onto the horses. Yeah. So what the horse carriage driver would do, he would steer the carriage in such a way that one of the tires, wooden tires, would scratch alongside the sidewalk in order to have a certain natural break to it so that the push wouldn't be so hard on the horses.
Yeah.
So, and this guy was the first truck driver. Now, when we got our first truck after World War II, sometimes in the 1950s, my grandfather was surprised that his rubber tires would break down and wear down so quickly, until he realized that the horse carriage driver continued his old system. He didn't trust the brakes of the truck, and he always was still going alongside the sidewalk, and thereby wearing down the rubber tires very quickly. Yeah, so yeah. So these kind of stories, there's a number of anecdotes around. Yeah, quite funny.
The graphic designer in me is really curious about this. So you talked about the little icon logo there, the tooling name. When it comes to the rest of the label, let's say the colors or even the font specifically, I'm really curious about the text. Is this something that has been constant throughout the past 5-6 generations in terms of the labeling and the branding of Schlenkerla? Is there a story behind this specific font, or how the bottles are presented, how the labels are presented? Is there anything about that you can tell us?
I mean, it's historic in a certain way because it's the old German typing, Altdeutsch they call it. You will find beer crates from the 1920s in which you see it similarly already. The insignia and document optics type, that started in the 1950s. So that's actually something my father introduced when he took over from my grandfather. So the Schlenkerla writing as such, that's older, but this is about 70 years old.
Okay.
And the little logo on top here, that's my contribution. That's the Bamberg Town Hall. I drew that a couple of years or 15 years ago, and we now have that on all the labels there. We used to have the alcohol contents there, but that's nowadays on the back side because all the legal information you needed, like 15 years ago, they changed the law and you need to add ingredients, barcode and all that. So we added a back label so some of the front information could go to the back and we could add that little nice logo there.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, you mentioned that briefly, going back a little bit to the brewing process, but I was curious to ask you about this. Do you have a special, secret family yeast that you use, like a strain that has been passed, in generations?
No. We use bottom fermenting yeast, and we're too small to have our own yeast management. So there's no family secret or recipe in that line. No, but maybe in the future.
We saw that the Marzen specifically, this is available in can now. Is that correct?
Our US importer does that.
Okay.
Be United International from Connecticut, US. They have a very amazing tank container project. They started that, I think, 12 years ago. So what they do is they pick up beers from their breweries in a cooled and pressurized tank container, basically a movable lagering vessel, if you will. And in that vessel, they bring it over to their operations center in Connecticut. And the original idea was to fill it to barrels, to bring fresher barrel beer to pubs and taverns on the East Coast of the United States. But eventually they decided to extend that program by canning that beer. So they call it a tank container freshness canning project, because in the tank vessel, in the transport, the beer doesn't age, because it's the same what happens when you store the beer in your lagering vessels at the brewery. So you're cutting off 4 to 5 weeks of lifetime in the distribution chain. So the beer is fresher than the bottled version. And at the same time, they do it all unfiltered in those cans. And with the modern canning technology, the oxygen levels are similar to that in bottles. So quality-wise, canning has gained a lot in the last couple of years. From the light influence, the cans are even better than the bottles, because obviously no light goes through. So it's a freshness project they're doing. And it works in such a way, when they order a tank container from us, they pre-sell all the cans which they fill from that. So everything is optimized on quick logistics, quick passing out to customers. So it's not as fresh as when you have it in Bamberg, obviously, but it's pretty much the freshest you can do, considering the long distance.
Well, that's amazing. Well, this kind of brings us to the last question that we had. It's a little bit more oriented to our channel. And for our viewers that might not be familiar with our channel is beer brackets. And the concept of beer brackets is pretty simple. Like, you have a beer to open the beer brackets, and then you have one to close. What do you think about this concept, Matthias?
Well, if I look at your logo, it's even more. You have a beer to open, a beer to close, and you have a beer in between. So whenever there's beer along, perfect, great concept.
And the second bracket is angled slightly, if you notice. It's almost like the dangling man from the Schlenkerla.
It's a little Schlenkerla. See?
The Schlenkerla bracket, yeah.
I'm looking the bracket is a little tilted to the side. It's a little... It's not safe.
Well, it reminds me a little bit of my time in Weinstefan. I studied brewing science in Weinstefan, and there was one course on beer tasting. Yeah. Well, not getting drunk or so, that was not the point. The point was that you recognize certain flavors, especially off flavors in beer. Yeah. And the final exam, I mean, picture that, a final exam. It was the only exam in my life I always enjoyed. You get in there and you have a table, and there's 20 bottles of beer there, and you try those through, and you have to write something to every beer, and that's rated in a university. It's amazing. And if you come from a bracket line, you had the number 1 and the number 20, and then you had all those in between. And the first challenge actually was to make a lineup. With which beer do you start, and with which do you end, and what do you do in between? So that's really something about your program. What you could convey to your viewers, that it is really important in what order you try beers when you drink something.
Exactly.
Especially the Schlenkerla. The Schlenkerla is actually something you should do at the end of a tasting, because everything coming afterwards will have a hard time, because the flavor of Schlenkerla is so rich. We were talking about anecdotes. One that comes to my mind in that connection. We have a beer filter at the brewery, because the classic Schlenkerla nowadays obviously is filtered. And beer filter, I'm not sure whether you're aware of that, usually works in such a way that you have a stainless steel construct in which you put filter layers similar to in a coffee machine inside. And then you use something like Kieselgur. I don't know the English word for that. It's like a powder, basically, which you float on top of that filter in order to filter the yeast out. Now, the thing is, when you buy these filter layers, they come with a lifetime or with a lifespan declaration of so and so many liters per filter unit. And the problem we're having is that we never get the liters out of that system, which we're supposed to. So I was complaining to our supplier and said, well, you said I have to get 1,000 hectoliters out of that, but I only do 500. Yeah, I want a refund or something. Yeah. And he said, well, look at the description. It says 1,000 hectoliters of beer. Schlenkerla is not beer. Schlenkerla is Schlenkerla. That doesn't count. So Schlenkerla is just thicker than most other beers you have out there, and it demands more of your palate. It demands more of your concentration on it, and it's not something you just drink on the side like that. Yeah, it's something that requires your attention. So it's really good to finish off your day with that, or you finish up your tasting line with that. When you start with a Schlenkerla, everything else after that will have a really hard time.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because part of what we try and convey with the concept is speaking about, having a conversation with somebody about the beers that you're trying. What are you starting with? What are you ending with, and why? And also just having an open, kind of frank discussion for people who might not necessarily be beer connoisseurs or understand the brewing process or understand the ingredients within that specific beer that they're trying, but to be able to kind of isolate specific things that they like about one beer and things that they don't like about another, and to have a conversation about it and be able to elaborate on that and communicate that. So that's one of the ideas of our concept that we're trying to get across, because you have, let's say, in the wine world, in the Scotch whiskey worlds, it's much more common for people to break down the actual substance behind the drink and to not criticize it, but to, let's say, review it, analyze using certain descriptors and to be very perceptive about those things. But in the beer world, there are, of course, people that do that are out there, but it's not as generalized as it is with other types of alcohols and other types of drinks. So that's one thing that we're trying to push. So definitely what you mentioned, we do that. What are you opening your beer brackets with? And what are you finishing your beer brackets with? And that Schlenkerla is definitely a good closing beer.
And we're kind of like already embedded in the concept, because as we said, this is the Schlenkerla bracket.
Okay, cool. You just have to write Schlenkerla into there then.
Matthias, thank you so much for joining us. Like I just said, this has been extremely fun for us and extremely informative, and I hope for our viewers as well. You guys got to learn something here, a little bit about the stories behind the infamous smoke beer that we did do a review on. That got a really good response. A lot of people commented on the video or contacted us directly saying they're going to try and find it. They didn't know that smoke beer was a thing, so hopefully they'll find this really interesting and really fascinating. And you've been a great guest. Thank you so much for joining us. Say cheers. Enjoy the office beer.
Thank you very much for organizing that and for having Schlenkerla in the beer bracket. So we put it there virtually.
Thank you.